So your API has suddenly become slow and you have no idea what is the reason. So here are the top reason that makes the API slow. So if your database query looks like this, where you can see you are fetching all the columns from your table and even if those columns that you don't need. So this makes unnecessary column retrieval and it makes the API payload to be much larger and that can make the API slower. Also you can see in this table we don't have any index. That means every time you look for a specific data, so the database will scan each and every row of the table until it finds the row. And that is what we call as a table scan, and that is not good for the performance of the table. And that makes the query run slower. So to fix this problem, you can add indexing on this table and specifically those tables which are very read frequently. And that way, after addition of the indexing, every time you search for a specific data, your database will not scan the entire table. Instead, from the indexing, it will directly know where the specific record is there. It will directly paste the data from there. Now the next thing that you have to check is that if you are doing n+1 query. If you just see this code, you can see here we are fetching some users from the database. We are getting some users. Now for each of the users, we are running a loop, and for each of the user, we are making another database call. And this is called n+1 query problem. And here, suppose that if in the users you have 10 data, for each of those users, it will make separate database call. That means 10 more database call will be made, and that is called a n+1 query problem. And in this case, you are making too much database call that can degrade the performance. So instead of writing the code like this, you can use join. You can write the join in the SQL query itself, and that will fetch you the required data in a single query itself, and that will improve the performance. So another thing you need to check that if your API is calling some external APIs. This mostly happens in the microservice architecture where your API calls another microservice and that microservice calls another microservice, like that it goes. And if any of those microservices that your API is calling, if those microservices are slower, then it has a cascading effect and it makes the overall response slower. So if you see, if your API is also calling some external APIs, and specifically if those data are not changing that much frequently, you can implement caching for the external APIs, so that every time your API doesn't call external API, instead it can cache the data, and that will make the overall API response faster. Another thing that you can check, if in your backend code you are doing too many synchronous operations, we are running a heavy loop and it is doing some heavy computation, this can block the main thread and this can make the API response slow. So if you are doing this kind of CPU intensive or long running task in the API, this kind of long running task or heavy computational work going on, then consider putting those in asynchronous mode. Another thing that you need to check is that if in your backend code you are doing too many sequential awaits like this. So you can see we are awaiting 3 API calls, and since we are using await in all of those API calls, that means until unless this one API call has been completed, it will not move to the next one. And this is usually fine, but if these 3 API calls are independent on each other, that means the second fetch order, if it is independent on whatever response we got from this one, that there is no reason that this should be blocked until unless the first API call has been called. So when these API calls are independent on each other, then you do not need to run them sequentially, you can instead run them parallelly. Just like that, you can run them in parallel mode. Now another thing is that the lack of caching. If in your backend code there are some repeated expensive database or API calls that are called very much frequently, then you can consider caching them. Just remember that when you are adding caching, then also you have to make sure that you are invalidating the cache properly time to time so that your users don't get stale data. So these are the top reasons which can make the API calls to be slower, and among them the reasons that can give you the better output is that optimizing the database query, implementation of the indexing, and implementation of caching. So I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please like, share, and as always, thanks for watching.